Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual discussion. A week ago today, Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to Tehran for meetings with his counterparts from Iran and Turkey. This was his second foreign trip outside of the former Soviet Union and only his second trip abroad since the invasion of Ukraine in February. The meetings between the leaders of the three regional powers were seen as an effort to bolster relations between their countries. To talk about the relationship between Russia and Iran and Turkey is German-Iranian political scientist and security expert Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad. Ali is also a 2022 ACG McCloy Fellow. So it is a special pleasure to welcome you, Ali. Herzlich willkommen.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction. I'm very glad to be with you.
Well, Ali, I'm delighted to have you with us for this conversation to help us sort of parse what's going on in the Middle East, particularly in light of the war in Ukraine. I think it's fair to say that it's nothing new for the representatives of these three countries to meet. They've been doing that during the war in Syria on a pretty regular basis. But as a watcher of Iran and a watcher of the region, do you think that this meeting had any special significance or symbolism coming just a few weeks after a series of Western summits, including the NATO and G7 summits, and also just days after US President Joe Biden traveled to the region?
Steve, as you said correctly, this format is not new. It has been in place, I think, since 2017 in the so-called Astana format. So Turkey, Russia, and Iran have been, meeting to talk about Syria. But when it comes to this meeting, probably it was more symbolic than substantive. I'm going to explain why in a minute. But the symbolism is quite obvious, I think, given the timing, just a few days after Joe Biden's visit to the Middle East, to Israel and Saudi Arabia, two major rivals of Iran. And it was Putin's first trip outside of the territory of the former Soviet Union. Of course, Putin in this format met with two heads of state. The Iranian was not that, it was a head of state as well, who can create headaches for the West. I think this is quite an important, characteristic of both Turkey, while being a member of NATO, has, time and again created some headaches also inside the alliance. And of course, Iran is a power of nuisance in the Middle East. So this was quite symbolic, I think, also from Moscow's side to tell the West, listen, first of all, we're not as isolated as you might think we are. And secondly, we're in good relations with two powers that are important, not only in the Middle East, but beyond, who could create headaches for Western policy. So this is, I think, the symbolism that we've seen.
I thought it was interesting as I was reading about the summit to note that there was obviously a meeting of the three heads of state, but then that there were also separate one-on-one meetings between Putin and the Iranian president Raisi and Turkey's Erdogan to talk about different issues and different matters. Do you read anything particular into those one-on-one meetings in addition to sort of the summit itself?
I think Russia entertains, different ties with both countries. So I think those one-on-one meetings do make sense, especially the Iranian one, or the one with the Iranian president, but most notably with the Iranian head of state, who is the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. And I think Russia-Iran relations have been always hotly debated in the past. And there has been some kind of, exaggeration as to their significance or misunderstanding. perhaps in the West, and I can explain in more detail how I view this kind of bilateral relationship. And then, of course, the Iranians have planned to forge a 20-year agreement with the Russians that was ready to sign by the turn of the year, but which is still not signed. But also was not signed during this particular meeting. There are, the most important thing to understand is probably the asymmetrical nature of the relationship between Russia and Iran. In the past, Russia has mostly been a opportunistic actor, of course. So the talk of a strategic alliance between the two is not really, based on substance. The reality is that all those powers, including Turkey, are not strategic allies in the sense that we could speak of, but they're, partners, opportunistic partners in different areas. And especially especially when it comes to the crucial area of creating headaches for the West. And Russia, for instance, during the nuclear crisis starting in the early 2000s, has always been interested to have the flame of Western Iranian conflict burning. Because with this flame burning, it could benefit from this kind of conflict, both politically, because it has been the power, before the sanctions, of course, that has been entertaining good working relations with both sides, but also to have an impact on the issue of Iran sanctions removal, because after all, the energy sanctions that have been imposed upon Iran have been to the benefit of Russia, because Iran could, for instance, not, enter the European energy market, a kind of competitor to Russian energy delivery. So by, making sure that, the conflict somehow, gets on, but without turning into a hot war, of course, but nevertheless, not also leading to normalization of relations between Iran and the West, which is absolutely a counterproductive, would be a counterproductive development for Iran. And because of this experience that the Iranians had with Russian behavior over the last decade and more, now there's been tremendous skepticism as to Russia's role, not only from Iran's society, that fears that the regime is just seeking outside guarantors of its regime's survival at times of unprecedented internal and external pressures, but also from Iran's political class or some elements of it. There is some skepticism as to the aims of Russian policies here.
So I think it's really interesting, the way that you described this relationship as being an asymmetrical relationship, and perhaps to help us all sort of understand what that looks like a little bit better. And before we go into some of the other topics that you just brought up, I think it'd be really interesting to hear about some of the common interests that these countries share, other than just being a spoiler or disruptor to the West, because these are also countries that have had a certain amount of conflict and or a certain amount of competition and even conflict between them. They don't see everything the same way. And so it would be really kind of interesting to hear from you as we sort of set this stage, to hear both about the common interests, but also the specific areas where you see competition and conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, the Iranian Revolution started with the ambition to, being neither Western nor Eastern. So to have some kind of equidistance toward both blocs as they used to be. But in reality, the conflict with the United States, of course, took center stage, so that the Islamic Republic over the past few decades had proclaimed a look to the East policy, geopolitical orientation that aims to forge closer, if not strategic ties with Russia and China, because the Iranians not only see them as potential anti-hegemonic or anti-US hegemonic powers with whom they can, align, but and also share a similar worldview, which is very much for a new world order beyond US domination. So this is, and secondly, also the parallels of their political structures facilitate such a rapprochement between the two, because after all of them, in this case, including China, are authoritarian states. So the Iranians would not have to fear that any of those two powers would table the issue of human rights, whereas the West, well, at some point, and at some point it doesn't, it would table those issues. So the look to the East, geopolitical orientation is very much favored from the very top of the system, that is Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And so as I said earlier, the fear is that, the regime has engaged with those two long-term agreements. One of them already signed with China, the other one still planned to be signed with Russia, are de facto selling out of national resources and interests, because the problem with those deals is we don't know the contents of it. So they're totally intransparent. Hence, there are wild speculations about the potential implications or what it means. For instance, since we're talking about Iran-Russia relations in particular today, there is the talk of, the Iranians granting Russia extreme control over, or quite important control over, a newly discovered gas field in the Caspian Sea, the Chaluz field. And also against the backdrop of Iran wanted to show some, lot of goodwill toward Russia. And providing them with political and economic benefits in exchange for Russia to support the Islamic Republic on the international stage. Diplomatically, politically, of course, Russia being a UN Security Council veto member, and also potentially inside the within the JCPOA process, whereas as I alluded to earlier, there is now increasing, skepticism as to Russia's, of whether Russia in this process has been a counterproductive or productive actor. So those are parallels of not only worldview, but specific interests of the respective regimes at hand that have, brought them closer to each other. Now, with the war in Ukraine and Russia being also subject to a similar set of sanctions that Iran has seen, of course, a new chapter in this kind of bilateral relations has opened, which would, if you look at it, which would probably be able to provide some benefits for Iran to use this kind of Russian weakness, one would guess. But I don't see any Iranian strategy toward maximizing their benefits in the bilateral relations with Russia. Instead, it seems that the political class is very much trying to seize the opportunity to provide the benefits the Kremlin wants in order to forge this kind of alliance or whatever they want to forge with Russia against the West in this particular moment. So this is the kind of ambition, or the kind of window opportunity that the Islamic Republic sees right now to draw even closer instead of recalculating some of its policies in order to maximize its profits in the bilateral ties.
It is interesting that this current conflict, this current situation, seems in a way to be pushing Iran and Russia a little bit closer together. We're seeing signs of their strengthening their collaboration when it comes to energy, when it comes to military cooperation. We haven't even talked about the possible sale of drones from Tehran to Moscow, which is something that we might get into. But you just raised the issue of sanctions, and I think it's interesting that both Russia and Iran are subject to Western sanctions. Iran, of course, because of its nuclear ambitions, and Russia because of its offensive in Ukraine. And so they have sort of an alignment there. And yet at the same time, they're keeping sort of Turkey on the sidelines. I mean, together with them, not on the not separate, in a way to demonstrate that neither Russia or Iran are completely isolated from the rest of the world. I think you had said at the very beginning, that the symbolism of this meeting to show that Moscow and Putin are not isolated, and that there are world leaders that will meet with Putin, was important. But in this regard, I wonder if you can talk any more about what sort of the strategy might be, to keep Turkey, a NATO member state, as part of this sort of threesome.
Mm-hmm. Before answering this specific question, I think it's important to recall that at the sidelines of the Tehran summit, an MOU was signed between the major energy companies of Russia and Iran. So the National Iranian Oil Company on the Iranian side and Gazprom on the Russian side, about a $45 billion Russian investment into Iran in the energy industry. But the problem is, I'm sure that some people in the West thought that this is going to really happen. But I think we can expect that. I mean, first of all, it's just a memorandum of understanding. So this is how they plan to do it. So there's no certainty whatsoever it's going to be materialized or not. Also, given the fact that Russia may have problems in terms of providing this kind of capital right now. So, and also, since you asked me before about competition, of course, now in this new chapter of relations, Iran is now a competitor with Russia in the energy market. Because, as you know, the Russians are selling their oil at discounted prices because of the Western oil embargo, not total oil embargo, but because of Western oil sanctions, I'd put it that way. So they have been, for instance, offering a $30 per barrel discount to the Chinese, which has been, $10 more than the Iranians had offered, because the Iranians, because also of this structural weakness vis-a-vis China, have offered discounted oil to China for the last years and decades. So this is also, and now, Iran sees to be, a competitor. So, which is also complicating things. And of course, Russia would want to learn from Iran sanctions circumvention, how to, circumvent sanctions. And the Iranians have been doing that, especially during the Biden administration, because of its, lack of fully implementing the sanctions regime globally. So the Iranians hope to benefit from this, because, the Iranians, although, they've been nevertheless able to, to engage in some kind of illicit exports of oil. So this is a field where the Russians could learn from the Iranians. And secondly, the issue of the drone sales. Because, as you know, over the last few years, also during the Trump administration, Iran has been using drones, also by, at the hands of Iranian proxies in the Middle East, to target the energy infrastructure of its, rival foes in the Arab Sheikhdom. So basically, notably, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And those drone attacks were surprisingly precise. And so this is the kind of, and of course, the Iranians would love to export stuff from their defensive industry. Yet, of course, because, there have been a denial from Tehran after Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, said that such a thing would be in the making. So we don't know yet about the fate of this drone issue, but I would think that this is something that is quite attractive for Moscow now, given also Turkey's Bayraktar drones that have been quite effective helping Ukraine against Russia. So alone, this kind of constellation tells you that all those three powers do not have the same position in any of those conflicts. So, when it comes to Syria, President Erdogan was pushing to get the green light from Moscow and Tehran to launch another attack on northern Syria. against Kurdish, Kurdish elements there. But Tehran and Tehran and Moscow have not been given this green light. There is and of course, so I think so. The main common denominator here is basically creating, the potential of creating problems for the West. So if you see that from that angle, you don't see that this might be as substantive to create a strategic alliance on it. So this is not something that would be in the making.
So I think, it's interesting to think about this, disruptive force that each of these three countries present, and that obviously might be part of the motivation for this. But I also thought it was interesting, as you were talking about the parallels in the sanction regimes that have been levied against Russia and Iran. And based on something that you said before we went live, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about sort of some of the parallels in Western policy vis-a-vis Russia and Iran. We tend to think of these as different policies, and yet certainly when it comes to the sanctions regime, we're seeing lots of parallels, and I'm sure that there are other parallels as well that you could draw on.
Yes, what I found, striking, I'm living in Germany and following the debates here, of course. When you talk about debates that that we've seen in the wake of the war on Ukraine about misconceptions on Russia, or this German term of Russland verstehe, it's quite striking to see that you can just replace the term Russia and Iran, because it basically, it has the same kind of premises. So I'm going to, mention a few. So when it comes to the Western approach toward those states, one, the problem with Russia was that, concerns, as you know, concerns from Eastern European countries were quite ignored by the core European states. And there have been warning, about potential malign ambitions by the Russians, but have been ignored because the core European states were, it seems, more interested to talk to the big guy and not really see the small states in between, and to have, maybe it was also in combination with some kind of a civilizational attitude that you would, rather talk to a great power. So when you look to Iran, it's quite striking, it's the same, because if, looking back at the Obama years and also the Obama doctrine, coming out of the Iraq war, the lessons of it, so no military intervention anymore. So hence, the kind of behavior that the US did in Syria. And so the problem with, so also the concerns of those states, so Syrians, Iraqis, most notably, were ignored in the context of forging the JCPOA. So Obama was, forging a deal with Tehran, and although Europeans were cheering it, there was quite a lot of skepticism in those, in those smaller countries neighboring Iran, because they would fear that it would provide, a carte blanche for Iran to do, to have a more expansive role in the Middle East. And the Europeans and the United States would basically ignore that because they would want primarily, if not exclusively, to save the JCPOA. So the interests of those people, and do not forget that the Iranians were heavily involved in the crackdown of the Iraqi revolutionary uprising in 2019, which Soleimani, back then even boasted about. And of course, in the genocidal adventures of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So the concern, so this is why we have a tremendous gap of understanding, and we do not understand why a lot of people in the Middle East and those Iraqis and Syrians do not like the kind of policy that Obama did, which is quite the opposite of what European leaders would think of it. So this is one parallel. The second parallel is the kind of misconception of the leaders at hand. So at times, of course, now we have, we have a demonization, if you like, of Putin on understandable grounds. But there was also a period where you had some kind of glorification of Putin and hopes associated with it that he might be some kind of a reformer. So hence a, kind of a desired ally for the West. The same is true with Western perceptions towards the former Iranian president, the so-called moderate presidency of Hassan Rouhani. He was explained by many in the West to be a reformer, to be a moderate, but he was neither. He was coming from the core of the security establishment. He was for 21 years before assuming the presidency, the representative of the supreme leader of Iran at the National Security Council. So by no stretch of the imagination, he was a reformist. So, of course, this kind of portrayal coincided with a kind of geopolitical, with the JCPOA. So maybe there was a need to portray him in a better light in order to justify doing business with him. This backfired because those two large uprisings that we've seen in Iran over the last few years started under his watch. So people had a different understanding of what his plans and policies were. And so the protests and the strong disillusionment by by a majority of Iranians came as a surprise to many Western observers because of this portraying. So and if you I think so, and of course the idea of Wandel durch Handel und Annäherung, which is drawing closer to an authoritarian state, doing trade with it in the hope that it's going to create some change in those countries. So this is also a parallel assumption in both cases. And lastly, I would also mention the lack of understanding of foreign policy conducted by authoritarian states, because authoritarian states do not necessarily follow national interests in their foreign policy, but perhaps they tend to more follow regime interests in their foreign policy. So, which would make their foreign policy at times more, more offensive, more aggressive, more expansive. So also, I think this is also not sufficiently understood in many Western capitals, that there might be an intricate relationship between the nature of the regimes and the kind of foreign policy they would choose. And this may be, anathema to presumptions of, we might think that Russia are going to be a, realpolitik player. So this would be the opposite assumption. But we've seen that, in those two cases, we've seen quite expansive and aggressive policies in their neighborhoods, for sure, last few years.
Thank you for that, Ali. I'd like to fold in a couple of viewer questions here, because I think they fit with what you were just talking about, and I'd also like to invite our other viewers to use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose some questions if they would like to. But one of our viewers here in New York asks if you think there is any chance of a revival of the JCPOA at this stage, given the fact that the United States and Iran seem to be at an impasse in negotiations. And she goes on to write, assuming that Europe is still fully committed to getting back into a deal, is there anything more Europe can do to convince the United States that a deal is necessary in order to increase global energy supplies at a crucial time for Europe and for the global economy?
Well, I think in this particular question, there are some important dimensions here. First of all, there is the assumption that, Iran is a natural, alternative in terms of energy provision. So I think even when sanctions would be removed, there are still complications, I think. And first of all, the Iranian energy industry would need a tremendous kind of investments. Secondly, of course, there is, when it comes to gas, there's tremendous domestic consumption in Iran. Thirdly, we still have Iran listed as FATF, which is Iran is blacklisted for terrorism financing and money laundering. So, assuming that all of that going to be settled, yes. So we can talk about such a scenario. But I think, and it seems there is important interest now in European policy circles to go this route, both in Brussels and Berlin, for instance, I think. But as I said, I believe that it's quite a simplistic reading. So the larger question, can you remind me of that?
Yeah, I mean, the overarching question is do you think that there's any chance of a revival of the JCPOA right now?
Yeah.
Given the tensions between the US and Iran?
Yeah. So this is the $1 billion question for sure. So we don't know. But what I can say is the following. And you will also see some kind of parallels with the Russian case, which is, of course, I mean, the U.S. under Trump has withdrawn from the deal, and imposed a maximum pressure campaign with maximum pressure sanctions on Iran that have been decimating Iranian oil income and putting a lot of pressure on the state. The Iranians, after a year of hoping that the Europeans would step in and providing some kind of economic benefits, which of course they did not do because of the nature of the power, because of global power structures. The Iranians have on their part started a maximum resistance policy, which is based on, first of all, creating regional nuisance for the United States and its allies by all kinds of acts of sabotage and so forth that we also talked about earlier. And secondly, by a nuclear escalation policy that is precisely meant to create some kind of alarmism in the West in particular, so that the West rushes to the negotiating table and offers maximum concessions. So that up until today, so the Iranians over the last year or so also did not feel any, it seems not feel any economic urgency, because they've been able to, to engage in some kind of illicit oil exports. Although we don't know about the exact, revenue that Iran has gotten from it, because it's a complex issue. But now Iran has, is quite advanced in its nuclear program. And this kind of illicit exports were able, were facilitated by the Trump administration's lack of full implementation of the global sanctions regime, which could have been a goodwill sign to Tehran. But the important issue is the following here, that the entire Iranian strategy is simply based on the perception of Western and especially US weakness. Right? So this is the kind of, so this is why the Iranians are, comfortable to continue this kind of path in their policies, because they're not really expecting the Biden administration to do something, forcefully. And also they do not think that the Biden administration has a plan B whatsoever. I mean, it was something that Malley also, during his Senate hearing a few weeks ago, admitted. So the Iranians know that. So based upon this weakness, so the very same could be said about Russia's or Putin's approach when it comes to policy, is that so it's Russian, it's Western weakness. So this is the assumption. So they can go as far, and of course also the nuclear issue, and in terms of nuclear blackmail, the Russians talking about the use of nuclear bomb, and also the Iranians talking about the potential of acquiring a nuclear bomb, also is another parallel, between the two. But yes, so the problem is that it seems now, despite severe economic problems, domestic ones in Iran, the situation is quite drastic. still it seems there is no economic urgency. Rather, there is the ambition to, when the JCPOA is revived, to claim a political victory.
Mm-hmm.
And this political victory would, for instance, involve, if not the delisting of Iran from the US State Department's FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, if not that, it would mean that, for instance, sanctions going to be removed against the construction arm empire of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, so which is the latest demand from Tehran. So the Iranians are testing the waters, and this is now they're doing that for many months. And I don't think that Europe in this equation, which was another part of the question, could somehow convince the United States. I think the only way forward is to, and so that the Iranians would take the West serious, is a kind of transatlantic approach to Iran that offers both pressure via sanctions, but also incentives. If Europe is seen as endlessly and incessantly being only looking at business relations with Iran, so the kind of same discussions that we have about, regarding Russia and Europe, this is not going to go anywhere. So I think,
No, that's very helpful. I have to apologize. One of our viewers said that they did not know what JCPOA is, and it is basically the Iran nuclear agreement, which has commonly been known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So I apologize for drifting into jargon, but I think that your explanation, Ali, of exactly what's going on and the complexities of this negotiation were spot on. So I want to thank you for that. Related to this, we have another viewer question from somebody who writes, how do foreign forays of Iran into aggressive actions actually benefit the regime? There seem to be more costs than benefits. So what are we not understanding in terms of the motivation? And I think this ties in with something you were saying earlier about authoritarian states not always thinking about the national interest, but rather thinking about the regime interest.
Absolutely. So I think in the Iran case, it is quite clear that there is a clear difference between national and regime interests, so which has been also on display with a lot of slogans by Iranians over the past few years. But when it comes to Iran's intervention or Iran's policy in the region, of course, it is to a strong extent ideologically driven, because after all, this comes, it's very much based upon the ambition of the Islamic Republic to export its revolution. So from 1979, and so Iran still has a revolutionary leadership. We don't have to forget that, although there might be new generations coming into power now, but the kind of worldview has not very much changed. So Iran not only sees that it has to export its Islamic revolution to to neighboring countries, hence creating some concerns or important concerns with those Arab states, the neighboring states, because they fear Iranian infiltration with, for instance, their Shia communities. But secondly, and the second point is more a continuity than a change between the monarchy and the Islamic Republic, there is the Iranian desire to be the superpower of the Middle East, for sure. So hence the superpower of the Middle East has to be involved in all conflicts, in all theaters of conflict, and has to have the upper hand. So the ambition to be number one collides with the ambition of Saudi Arabia to be number one in the Middle East and also in the wider Islamic world. So this kind of tensions that, for instance, exist between those two regional rivals because of the maximalistic positions that are quite the same and which cannot be reconciled. And thirdly, I would say that there is also a political economic aspect to Iranian involvement in the region because, as you know, Iranian foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, is only dictated by the Revolutionary Guards and the so-called Supreme Leader's Office, which is a quasi-parallel government. So it's not the foreign ministry that runs the show. I mean, today, well, the foreign ministry is also headed by someone who's described as a soft face of the IRGC. So there is a total alignment now in the halls of power in Tehran by various hardline factions. But the IRGC is the most important political economic player in Iran, and hence it also tries to benefit economically with a kind of economic relations that Iran entertains with, for instance, Iraq or Afghanistan on the other side. So those same elements also engage in business activities there.
So when thinking about sort of the regional role of Iran and your comment just now about its desire to be a superpower of the Middle East, this obviously has a lot to do with the relationships that it has with its neighbors and with other countries in the region. And one of our viewers is curious to know how you view Iran's relationship with post-Soviet Muslim states. How do you see those developing?
Well, that's quite a huge, topic. But if you look at the history, for instance, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you see there has been quite a competition in Central Asia, not only involving the Islamic Republic of Iran, but also Turkey as another major Muslim country. So, it doesn't mean that, the Muslim, being a Muslim majority Central Asian country would draw you closer to the Islamic Republic of Iran necessarily. There is other major, Muslim majority countries in the region that may have a less ideological approach to this region. For instance, the Turks. But with some of them, for instance, Tajikistan, Iran has a cultural language affinity and a history. So this is, but I think, of course, you have to also factor in China. So it's not only about this kind of, let's say, religion-based affiliations.
And I'd like to definitely come back to sort of the great power struggle and rivalry a little bit later in the conversation, because I do think that that's a key topic for us to address today. Another viewer has another question about sanctions, since we were talking about that before, and he writes that Western media describes the impact of sanctions as being fairly severe on Iran. Does that align with your view of the situation?
Again, a very complex issue. I've been working a lot about the effects of Iran sanctions on, first, state-society relations, and secondly, on the geoeconomic arena. Geoeconomic arena, I briefly explained that Russia and China, but also India, have been able to benefit from those sanctions that were imposed on Iran in order to maximize their own benefits in bilateral relations. So I've covered this in my book that was published last year, Iran and Emerging New World Order. On state-society relations, I think it's a multifaceted picture. I said earlier that Trump's sanctions very much decimated Iranian oil income and hence also put a lot of pressure. I mean, Iranian officials were talking about costs, going up to $200 billion. So there have been tremendous pressure, especially at the time when, disillusionment from below grew or was growing. So this is quite clear. And but the problem is that, which is also quite surprising, is that, or not surprising, or it could be surprising to some European, audiences, is that there have been, many in Iran who were supporting sanctions against Tehran because of the inability of conducting change at home with their own hands, because there is no rule of law in Iran. The Islamic Republic, the political structure cannot be reformed, So there is a little chance for average Iranians to participate in the political process and to, push for changes. Hence, there is some kind of hope of an outside power coming in to step in, to helping them and to weaken the autocrats via sanctions. And in this context, sanctions would be very important. So what is basically always happening, and this is what I also laid out in my book, which I think has not been really much discussed, is that authoritarian states tend to externalize the cost of sanctions, both discursively and materially, onto the civilian population. So that is, discursively, of course, every kind of dissidence would be, labeled as, someone, helping U.S. imperialism or U.S. agenda or whatever. Materially, one could, Tehran tells, factory workers that they have not been paid for, for many months because of sanctions. Whereas the reality is that all those problems are primarily homemade. So there is a tremendous gap of understanding the impact of sanctions, especially between Europe and Iran, because most Europeans would argue that actually the bulk of Iran's economic crisis goes back to sanctions, whereas there's a lot of Iranian economists inside of Iran who would argue the very opposite. So that a small, number of problems, relatively small percentage of the economic woes at home can be traced back to the effects of sanctions, because it goes back to the very political economy of the Islamic Republic, which is very much ideologically grounded. So there, those who are pro-regime get the jobs, but then the quality suffers. There is huge monopolization by the state. There is no virtual, private sector. There's mismanagement, there's high corruption. So all of that weighs much more heavily when you look at it, at the impact of sanctions. So sanctions is a very, very complex and tricky issue. And I think those authoritarian states also know the discourse about sanctions and the kind of reticence that we have also from the civil society perspective in the West vis-a-vis sanctions. So they also try to, enter this kind of discursive arena to their benefit.
So I want to come back to sort of our starting point, the meeting between the heads of state of Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and you touched on this very briefly when we were talking earlier, and I want to maybe try to draw you out a little bit more. Of the three, Russia is obviously the strongest, and you talked about an asymmetric relationship between Russia and Iran. But Russia is weakened. Do you think that either Ankara or Tehran will sort of try to take advantage of this in some way as they're jockeying for power, right? As they're trying to think about their position on the world stage?
I think for President Erdogan, we've seen it in the recent past that he has been trying to benefit from the increasing rise of tensions between his Western NATO allies, let's put it that way, and Russia. For instance, when it came to Erdogan's, demand to those, potentially to Sweden and Finland in particular, against Kurdish dissident groups there. So of course, this is something that Erdogan, is very much, focused on, and also he tries to extend the sphere of influence of Turkey now by pushing for this kind of military incursion into northern Syria, also potentially taking advantage of Russian weakness and. But I think, nevertheless, the framework of NATO that is still existent in the case of Turkey is some kind of containing some kind of more extravagant, deviations from Turkey. On Iran and Russia, I think I've said, I explained it that. The Iranians, although they could benefit from this Russian weakness, doesn't seem to be doing that, and this is reinforcing fears in Iran that the regime is, seeking something ominous, and is just trying to get closer to China in order to Russia in order to build a new world order. An anti-American one, anti-Western one. So those are the desires that are very much, pushing the two sides together. But then again, the crucial issue here is what is in the deal? What is in the deal? And what are the many ramifications? Because there is no doubt that both Moscow and Beijing have also tremendous power and influence in Tehran itself, which is something that the West does not fully understand, I think. This is something that, of course, is also, it's not transparent always, but it's something to be watched.
So, Ali, we have a couple of minutes left, and I think that this ties in well with what you were just talking about. You mentioned earlier, of course, your recent book that came out titled "Iran in an Emerging New World Order," and during your McCloy Fellowship in Global Trends, you'll be conducting research on transatlantic foreign policy toward authoritarian states. And so I think that there's definitely a dovetailing of thought and idea there. But I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts on how you see great power competition unfolding in the years to come, and what sort of new alliances or blocks we might see. And I'm asking particularly because I think that this is an interesting notion of how Russia, Turkey, and Iran have been meeting regularly since 2017. They're continuing to meet, although the circumstances of their meetings are very different. You've talked a little bit about China and the comments that you've made so far today. So what's your, and undoubtedly we could spend a separate hour talking about sort of the great power rivalry and the new world order, but in a nutshell, in just a few minutes, what are your thoughts about how that might unfold?
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to make it very brief. So after the end of unipolarity, there was much talk about a veritable multipolar world order, to come into existence, a fully fledged one. But what I argue in my book is that no, this is not a multipolar order that we've seen post unipolarity. So I have coined the term of imperial interpolarity to explain the world order configurations after unipolarity, and using the case of Iran, where I showed that Russia's, India's, and China's respective relations and actions toward Iran are a product of their relationship with the imperial power, which is the United States. So they're not going to replace they're not going to favor Iran over their interests vis-a-vis the United States. Hence, right. Iran is strategically in a very weak position. But now it seems we may have entered a new stage because of this conflict between Russia and the West and the sanctions. And of course, there may be. So I don't think that we're going to see a new alliance emerging, or between Russia and China, for instance. I mean, the Chinese can very much benefit from Russian weakness, and certainly done so. It seems also they've also stopped important foreign direct investment to China. So all of that is part of a new picture that is now emerging. And of course, also how India behaves, and so all of that is a complex picture. But what I would argue is that rather than seeing alliances in the old sense of the word, we're going to see multi-alignments, and those multi-alignments are at play in different dimensions, and of course this just adds to the complexity that we see here. But yeah, so I mean, there's much more to talk about this, but we don't have the time. And also,
let's make a date as you're doing your research during the fellowship to continue that conversation, because I do think that that's a separate conversation in and of itself, but it's one that touches very closely on what you have been talking about today, and on the situation that we're seeing unfold. One country we've not really talked very much about, but one of our viewers just wrote something in the chat, is of course India. And so maybe in the 90 seconds we have left, any thoughts on what India's role might be in this new world order that we'll see? Because I think the jury is kind of out on what direction India might take.
Well, I mean, as you've seen from leading Indian politicians, they were not happy by Western calls upon them to also, engage in the kind of, energy sanctions against Russia. With one senior Indian officials even saying that the kind of demand that you have toward us in terms of slashing the imports is, I mean, this is what Europe imports in one afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, there's some problems, obviously, with credibility of the West. And I think this credibility problem goes back to the Iraq War. I think this has been, opening the, Pandora's box in terms of, fragilizing, quite importantly, Western credibility. And we see the effects nowadays in terms of, some Western surprises over the lack of real, international support to their stance. So I think some important repairing ought to be done here. Otherwise, I think it's very difficult. But of course, India is very much also aligned with the United States in terms of military cooperation. This is going to be in place. There has now been, some international corridors that we've been, talking about. There have been, connecting, for instance, Russia and Iran, but also further down to India. So, of course, I mean, for India, for instance, Iran is important as a route toward Central Asian markets. So all of this going to remain in place, and all of this going to be developed and is going to evolve. But I'm not expecting major breakthroughs within the next, shortly. So we're going to see some movements here.
Yeah.
So in other words, we have to watch this complexity unfolding.
Well, Ali, thank you so much for helping us understand some of the complexity and for your insights today. I look very much forward to continuing the conversation with you. And I think, given how complex the situation is and how many developments there will be other opportunities for us to have conversations like this one today. But for now, let me wish you well, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks so much for the great discussion that we had today. I look forward to more.